It's very interesting that Professor Domhoff has done an in-depth study on the power elite. His books are amazingly accurate, his definitions very clear, so we invited him to speak at Energy is God. So we sat down to have lunch with Professor Domhoff, and we found that morally and religiously he was non-aligned, that although he had in his hands the key to the watchers, the fallen ones, the tares among the wheat, such an analysis, such a labeling of his power elite had never even crossed his mind. Nevertheless, we go to his source because it is so good. Now, if you can take someone like that and all of the students whom he is teaching and introduce the theory behind the theory, then you have the connecting links. I have found it very interesting, and so has our research staff, to go here and there, talking to people in various positions politically, various levels of understanding and alignment, some very Christian, some very atheist, some humanists, whatever they may be, along the whole spectrum. That positioning doesn't seem to conflict with the fact that they are freedom lovers. But somehow these great freedom lovers, these friends of freedom, do not connect. They all have their islands of enlightenment, the place through which they really see clearly. And then they don't go beyond it because basically they don't believe in a heavenly hierarchical order and its lineage and descent affecting the hierarchy of people upon earth. As you know, that was effectively removed from our understanding with the removal of the works of Origen of Alexandria, who completely understood, in a direct descent from those who knew Jesus, the heavenly hierarchies and the orders of sons and daughters of God and the orders of the fallen ones. So it seems that there are islands of light in the most unexpected places, and if you've ever played with water on a table, you know how you take your finger and you draw them together and you have one big puddle? Well, that's what we have to do. We have to draw these islands of light together. And the connection is the surefire light of the Holy Spirit, the love of your heart. And love is a most convincing potion. When you stand to deliver the word because you love, when you have nothing else propping you up, no other strength, but you love that person or those people so much that your strength absolutely will not fail you till you've delivered the whole message. And I know you can do it because I know God in you will do it when you love that much. And I really love these people. I love them no matter what they believe, because I realize that they are pocketed and socketed and segmented by the very forces that are promoting this entire conspiracy. It's called the power elite, the super rich, the ruling class, whatever you want to call it. It's the same stream of the tares among the wheat, the same fallen ones. Not all rich people are fallen ones. There are many sons and daughters of God upon the earth whose rightful inheritance has been abundance and the abundant life. Many of these people are the true aristocracy descending from the lineage of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they are the refined, cultured people who hold the real inner strands of the children of God and the light bearers together. Revolutions come, and there are mass bloodbaths and executions, and the real inner aristocracy of the planet that descends from the hierarchy of the sons and daughters of God and the angels who never fell, they are wiped out along with the fallen ones. And of course, that is the purpose of revolution. Revolution is staged in many cases, not the American Revolution, but the French, the Russian. They are staged by the extremes of right and left, relative good and evil. They are staged to get rid of the sons and daughters of God who have inherited whether the thrones or the lineal descent of authority and power that has its base in sovereignty or in the accumulation of wealth. This is what the fallen ones do. They will create revolutions and they will murder entire thousands and millions of their own seed of the wicked. They consider their own kind expendable as long as when things right themselves again, they have more centralized power. And there has been immense manipulation of this kind in the First and Second World War. The public be damned, the public is expendable, and wars are used to confuse who is on whose side. The fallen ones will persecute their own kind to make themselves look as though they are the champions of the light. So the American ruling class is more than simply a collection of rich and powerful people. As Professor Dumhoff implies, it is a group of individuals who are politically and socially cohesive. Many of the members know each other personally. The backbone of the power elite nationally and internationally is a network of organizations known as round table organizations, formed initially by Cecil Rhodes, the first-class watcher, the imperialist par excellence. He once lamented to a friend, quote, "The world is nearly all parceled out, and what there is left of it is being divided up, conquered, and colonized. Think of the stars that you see overhead at night, these vast worlds which we can never reach. I would annex planets if I could. I often think of that." It takes a Luciferian to make a statement like that. His immediate goals were more modest, however. The original purpose of the Round Table groups, obviously the perversion of King Arthur's court, was to federate the English-speaking nations and then the world in essence. He desired to form a world government. The money to carry out the scheme came from Rhodes' exploitation of the gold and diamond mines in South Africa and Rhodesia. He carried this out with financial backing from the Rothschilds. Despite their enormous influence domestically and globally, most Americans, in fact most citizens of the planet, have never heard of the Round Table organizations. In part, it is because they were organized as secret societies and carried out most of their activities covertly in a conspiratorial fashion. Professor Quigley tells us that the first Round Table organization was formally established on February 5, 1891, when Cecil Rhodes and William Stead organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming of for 16 years. Rhodes was the leader. His executive committee included Lord Rothschild. Others formed a circle of initiates, that was their name. A circle of initiates, and still others formed an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, which were later organized as a Round Table organization. The Round Table was at the center of policy planning groups such as the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England, the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. These two groups plan foreign policy for the respective nations far more than most people realize. The CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, works so closely with the State Department on many issues, it's often impossible to tell if a foreign policy initiative originates at the Department of State or at the Council on Foreign Relations. Among other things, the CFR helps plan foreign policy that is favorable to the far-flung international business enterprises which the leaders of the CFR have strewn across the globe. So the Round Tables are Cecil Rhodes' instruments for the securing of his financial empire through the governments of the states. Other Round Table organizations which appeared were the Institute of Pacific Relations, which set up branches in 12 countries, holding territory in the Pacific area, as well as a variety of other organizations, including the Bilderberg Group, Pugwash Conference, and the Business Round Table. The major figures in the Round Table groups were the international bankers and industrialists, the monopolists, and their associates. The Council on Foreign Relations was formed in 1918, quote, by a few gentlemen. The expressed purpose of the organization was to afford a continuous conference on foreign affairs, bringing together at each meeting international thinkers so that in the course of the year, several hundred expert minds in finance, industry, education, statecraft, and science will have been brought to bear on international problems. We see then that it is a shadow government, and it is occupied by international figures who then become the shadow government for all nations, controlling and protecting multinational corporations in all nations. The major forces behind the Council on Foreign Relations were Morgan and Rockefeller. You know, Saint Germain has often commented on the fact that if you look at the whole era of history, even for the past 5,000 years, it is the same sons of God that have re-embodied East and West over and over again who have been the major and key figures that have affected the cultural revolutions and Renaissance sponsored by the Great White Brotherhood. You look at the embodiments of Saint Germain and El Morya alone, and they take in some of the greatest minds East and West. Well, the same thing is true of the false hierarchy. These watchers have returned again and again. They have a continuity of purpose, and they have set themselves as protagonists of the representatives of the Great White Brotherhood. They know each other. The fallen ones know the sons of light know the fallen ones. Often when I am in prayer and meditation and making intense calls for the nations and the judgment of those of the power elite in control, I'll run across figures and I will invoke Saint Germain for the stopping and the staying of that action, and he will identify an individual to me as someone that is opposed, as to quote him, almost every move he has sought to take for freedom in the last 2,000 years. And that same individual would be there each time a plan of freedom was about to be released. There would be that same one. Saint Germain has expressed gratitude again and again for the calls made not only by me but by you for the judgment of these individuals thwarting the plan of freedom economically and politically. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that Rockefeller and Morgan appear again. And it shouldn't be any surprise that they were there on Atlantis and in the coming again in the Middle East of the forces of light and darkness. So we would be astounded to know who these people were in previous history. They're always identifiable by their means and by their goals. So the Council on Foreign Relations currently has about 1,400 members, roughly half of which have served in the highest levels of our government. Almost invariably, the Secretaries of State, Defense, Treasury, and the National Security Council Advisor are members of the Council. The CFR, as it is called, does not confine its activities to foreign policy, but actively intervenes in every area of national and international affairs. Our population-controlled policy is just one example of a single policy decision which had national and international significance of such a far-reaching influence that it touched lives in areas as urban and advanced as Manhattan and as backward as the most undeveloped areas of Africa. The population control policy. The CFR, key members of the Council, and a constellation of other policy planning groups played a role in development, popularization, and adoption of our population control policies. The leading establishment figures in population control lobby were John D. Rockefeller III, General William Draper, and Hugh Moore, all leading CFR members. The primary reasons they sought the population policy were economic and hence political. This was the angle used to sell the policy to Congress. Behind the erstwhile establishment concern for the well-being of the underprivileged who would be hurt by overpopulation was a desire to sustain a more or less static society in third world nations, unaligned nations, nations not totally controlled either by the forces of communism or international capitalism. Population growth would bring dynamism and that nasty word, nationalism, independence, community of the Holy Spirit, a desire to develop the inner potential and identity and to move forward with a group karma. The likely outcome was that 1, the people in a foreign land might want to use their own resources and on their own terms. And 2, internal nationalist drives might dictate a domestic course of policy far different than what the CFR was hoping for. Thus, under the idea of saving the world from overpopulation and themselves from economic and political trouble, the power elite used all their resources to convince the public that there were too many of us. As a result of their actions, which ultimately influenced the Supreme Court, abortion became a constitutional right. It is probably one of the most far-reaching and deadly policies that has totally fooled the best of us. It has fooled freedom lovers right and left, and the children of God think they are being merciful and compassionate in limiting their families and in killing offspring who are not the very best of specimens. Behind abortion, then, is the issue of the population control of the watchers. Unlimited multiplying and replenishing of the earth spells the death to the seed of the wicked. This message has to be shouted from the rooftops. The control of the people of God has been mass sterilization in India under that watcher, Indira Gandhi. Mass sterilization, tampering with the powerful energy of the seed of Alpha, the limiting of the incarnating souls in that holy land. Argument upon argument taken up by the children of God in defense of the seed of the wicked. There has never been a century that the seed of the wicked has not tried, and in many cases succeeded, to use you and me as the mouthpiece for the justification of their wickedness. It is totally unbearable to me to think that 5 million babies in America are not here because the people have swallowed the whale. And I'm determined that we're going to do something about it. In general, roundtable or policy planning groups, as they were often called, afforded members of the power elite the opportunity to meet both on a national and international basis, coordinate their policies, and plan their strategies. Policy planning groups now occupy the central and the most important position in the policy-making process in America. They bring together people at the top of the corporate and financial institutions, the universities, the foundations, the mass media, the powerful law firms, the top intellectuals, and influential figures in government. They review the relevant university and foundation-supported research on topics of interest, and more importantly, they try to reach a consensus about what action should be taken on national problems under study. Their goal is to develop action recommendations. Policy planning groups see to it that the goals of the power elite are ultimately translated into government policy. Policy making is often a complex process, requiring the coordination and the cooperation of wealthy individuals who can supply funds during the research phase, foundations who also provide funding, and universities and think tanks who actually research these policies. Then the recommendations are evaluated by the policy planning groups, who present them to government commissions and councils on one hand, and the national news media on the other. The government councils prepare reports and policy recommendations within the legislative framework, and the news media focuses public attention on the policy recommendations. The combined impetus of the media and the government councils converge on the executive branch, the congressional committees, and/or the Supreme Court in order to see that their ideas are finally enacted into law. The amazing thing about these fallen ones is their technique of organization from the top to the bottom. Saint Germain's major attention at this conference is on the organization of the light bearers, their unification by enlightenment, and they're working together in concerted effort in their own round tables, if you will, in their own committees around the face of the earth, coming together to study and discuss and have dialogue on these issues, which forces you to do research and draw conclusions. So often our ideas on politics and economics are so terribly vague that if someone puts a question to us, would you be for this or would you be for that? We have no idea because we have not studied what is behind the issues. Because the children of God are trained to believe that it is not their role to know the answers because someone at the top of the echelons, that is their job. They are more qualified to run the government and to answer these complex questions than we are. And that is the aura of ability that the Luciferians put out, and the children of the light accept it. And they don't realize that their own hearts and the purity of the heart is the best government, the best key to government. That people who have too much intellectual knowledge without loyalties to freedom, to light, to God, always make the wrong decisions, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So Saint Germain wants to see an alignment, nation by nation, of the children of the light, who determine to be independent of both world communism and world capitalism. That was my mission in going to Ghana. I sat with its leaders and I told them that they were in the death grips to allow the Soviet Union its penetration of its society, as well as multinational corporations. And I said the only way to have a prosperous and independent Ghana is to get back on the gold standard. You know, Ghana is rich in gold. And to kick out these representatives of the Soviet bloc nations, and to not be so greedy as to constantly be accepting the interference of the international capitalists and all the products they offer a society, and actually accelerate that society beyond its development. Well, their leaders were frightened of the message, and now they're dead. The very ones I spoke to and warned of the manipulation and of what was coming and what would be done. I warned them to the letter. I told them they would not be alive to tell the tale. I warned them of their personal corruption, their division among themselves, and they did not listen. They did not heed the message of the Ascended Masters. And that was only a year and a half ago. How quickly karma descends. Yesterday, while you were decreeing, I had a phone call from Adolphus Tolbert, who is the son of the president of Liberia, who had been calling us during our Easter conference asking for invocations. And he said, I had to call you and tell you, by the grace of Almighty God and the Ascended Masters, Liberia is united. We have peace and harmony and hope. The most amazing thing that I really saw, as Saint Germain pointed out to me yesterday, was that I delivered the identical message to both nations. I gave the story of the Fatima prophecy and what was the portend for the world if it were not heeded. I exposed the capitalist communist conspiracy right out of the book of Revelation. In Ghana, most of the heads of government stayed home. A few dared to join me on the platform as I spoke the message. In Liberia, the president, the vice president, the leaders of every religious body, members of the Congress, and the cabinet all attended the lecture, all sat with me on the platform. They gave me their total support, were unashamed to do so, and not only that, hailed the message as the greatest message they'd ever heard. Not only were they receptive of it, but they became Sheilas. The individual Adolphus that I'm speaking of. Adolphus was a Sheila before I went there. He has changed his entire life. He's corrected every human habit that I exposed, which was not in keeping with the ascended masters. He confessed to me his sins in complete trust that I would take them to my heart and there lay them on the altar of the sacred fire. He determined to renounce any and all practices not in keeping with ascended master law, and he did so. He carried out his commitment to the brotherhood. With his own money, he paid for radio time on the air to give the masters of teachings throughout Liberia. He just finished conducting a 7-day rally on the Christian theme. He's also a Baptist minister, as his father is the head of the Baptist Church of Liberia. He did everything that an individual could do who heads a law firm and works daily in Congress in his own government of Liberia. Not only that, but wherever he goes on the face of the earth, and whoever comes to Liberia who is entertained hears all about Mother Clare and the Ascended Masters. I'm telling you this for a very important reason. A true Chela of the Ascended Masters has protection. But individuals who try to use the messenger or the Ascended Masters to prop up their own human personalities, their human ideologies, and to cover over their sin and appear sanctified before the people, these are the ones who receive the judgment. So here are 2 nations of Africa. One literally leveled and destroyed. The other, Liberia, suffered rebellion by certain elements of communist origin, but by the prayer and intercession of this body, as well as the prayers of Adolphus and others in that country, that has been set aside. The political prisoners who were imprisoned for starting these riots and causing these millions of dollars of damage have been granted clemency by President Talbert. They have written him letters of praise saying they will work in and with the government, and they are united and stand. Now Adolphus knows that they have socialist leanings and that there are still individuals in the country who have communist or Marxist goals. But nevertheless, there has been a return to unity, and he is at peace, and he says, I feel you with me every day and every hour. And I am not only with him every hour, but with every true Chela. But when Chelas begin to compromise, they lose not only the messenger's backing, which only comes from the Great White Brotherhood, but they lose all of the Ascended Masters' backing. So Saint Germain has a great strategy. There are still nations upon this planet who are unaligned. They're not totally taken over by communism. They have sons and daughters of light in their governments, and they're not taken over by the international corporations. It is Saint Germain's desire to head off the conspirators at the pass. Head them off at the pass, he says. Get there first and plant your amethyst jewel. All you need is 2 or 3, but you need it nation by nation, and there are nations across the face of the earth who have awakened rudely to the reality that the United States government is no longer the friend of freedom or the watchman on the wall of world freedom. And so those nations are sitting stranded, wondering what they're going to do. I'm going to give you a list of these nations, not at this moment, but later on today. And I'd like us to get into our own roundtable discussion groups in this coming 2-week seminar and sit down and consider who among us is able and willing to go to these nations. All you need is a pillar of intense violet fire in the center, and you have begun the process. Obviously, it's going to take more than that, but it is the beginning, and without it, they are just a field day and a heyday for manipulation. So I have a few more points to expose But I want you to keep in mind that there is a strategy and there is a path of victory. And I believe that putting together enlightenment and keepers of the flame ready for action, that there's a great deal that a small band of devotees can do. And we heard in the dictation, 5,000 key individuals in key positions have saved an entire planetary body. Now, the control of the media, as you know, is absolutely essential in translating policy recommendations into government policy or law. The power elite has a firm control on the media. 3 private corporations, CBS, NBC, and ABC, determine what the people will see and hear about the world. They feed the 600 local TV stations with 90% of the news and entertainment that is broadcast. Most of the nation's 1,748 daily newspapers receive their news from AP and/or UPI wire services. The 10 largest newspaper chains account for 1/3 of the total newspaper circulation in the country. Television, for example, broadcasts the values of the elite. While claiming to present merely a mirror of society, newsmakers credit themselves with the success of the civil rights movement, ending the Vietnam War, exposing Watergate, and ousting 2 presidents from office. The Trilateral Commission is the policy planning group that is influencing our lives in an extraordinary way. There's something very interesting happening on the TV, and it's happening more and more. At least in California, there is a real rage of programs that go on by the hour of fundamentalist or charismatic Christian groups. And they seem to have something in common in that they're always asking for money, they're always very well dressed, and they always have singers and dancers that move with jazz or rock beats telling the story of Jesus. Well, you look at these programs, and the energy coming through them literally pains all 7 chakras. But worst of all, the image portrayed, which is a power elite image, is this is Christianity, this is what Christ is going to do for you, and this is the end all and be all. This is religion in America today. So the people who have a little more evolution behind them, who've been around a little bit longer, know better, know that isn't true religion, but are nauseated and turned off by this particular Luciferian message of Jesus Christ and what the true coming of the Christ is. So what the power elite does is they neutralize religious fervor by showing these kinds of programs, giving them free time. Now, you don't see free time to unorthodox movements. You don't see equal recognition. You see the unorthodox movements that have any power having to defend themselves with accusations of being a cult because they are new and because they are offbeat, ostensibly. But the reality is that those who manage life fear what they have labeled as the mark of every cult, the charismatic leader. It's the funniest thing. You know, Jesus began as the charismatic leader of a cult. And yet, if there is no leader of the churches or the synagogues or the Muslim nations, how do you have a focal point? How do you have a shepherd? So the decapitation of leadership, any effective leadership, on the basis that if someone is a leader, he can lead people down the primrose path of self-destruction, therefore there should be no leaders. It's the manipulation of philosophy for the ends of the fallen ones. And yet who are they? They are the cult leaders by par excellence, leading in their economic and political cults nations to absolute ruin. So the fallen ones are against the leadership of the children of light and the sons and daughters of God. And they use the media to that purpose, and they use their own to that purpose. The using of Jonestown to down all religion and all New Age movements is a typical act of the fallen ones deciding that their own are expendable. Sacrifice 900 people? Very easy. Jim Jones, aligned at inner levels with the fallen ones, a professed Marxist who's determined to destroy the Bible and religion, who said so in his meetings, assembles around himself people who are willing to take that kind of rot and follow him to South America in rebellion against the United States. He himself is willing to sacrifice himself under the false hierarchies of the fallen ones and commit this mass murder just to cast this dark image across the face of all emergent groups. Now you say that's preposterous. Well, it isn't if you understand that the conspiracy functions from the astral plane. It functions in a hierarchy and an order that is the false hierarchy, antithesis of the Great White Brotherhood. These individuals are not only in embodiment, they're out of embodiment. They use each other and they're pulling the strings. And the interesting mark of Jim Jones is that he's a pal of all the liberals. A pal of all the liberals. Interesting, isn't it? I think we should get on with the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission is a policy planning group that is influencing our lives in an extraordinary way. Formed in 1973 by private citizens of Western Europe, Japan, and North America to foster closer cooperation among these regions on common problems. That is its stated purpose. The organization came into being at the suggestion of, guess who? David Rockefeller. The Trilateral Commission has about 200 members who come from each of the three trilateral areas. The Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations have a more than ordinary relationship. David Rockefeller, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, also serves as a director of the Trilateral Commission. Makes the whole thing sound like if you could just isolate and call to judgment the fallen ones and cut free the sons and daughters of God, the Battle of Armageddon will have been fought and won because the same people and the same few people are there. Cyrus Vance, a Trilateral Commissioner, served as the vice chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. Other members of the Trilateral Commission who served as either a director or an officer in the Council of Foreign Relations or on one of their important committees are W. Michael Blumenthal, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Hedley Donovan, Paul Warnke, and Richard Cooper. Prior to resigning in order to become National Security Council advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski hand-picked the 200 members of the Trilateral Commission, which some have described as the closest thing possible to a board of directors of the world. A board of directors of the world. You can see that it's an imitation of the councils of the Royal Teton, of the Himalayas, of Darjeeling, of Kuan Yin, of Lake Titicaca. It's the formation of a hierarchy, point counterpoint, of the inner hierarchy of light. The Ascended Masters say that the light bearers, the children of God, the sons and daughters of God, are the real rulers of the earth. At inner levels, the people of light are the ones whom the Ascended Masters accept as having authority for the earth and her governments. And if they could just get these children of the light to make daily calls on what they want to happen in the governments and in the nations, those calls are the calls that would be honored. It's a question of realizing your worth and who you are and assuming your role and taking the responsibility of studying the issues, deciding which way an issue should go, and then casting your vote by dynamic decrees. Your vote will be heard because you serve under the 14 Ascended Masters who govern the destiny of America. So these 200 members of the Trilateral Commission are the antithesis, the false hierarchy opposition to the 14 Ascended Masters and all of their committees of ascended and unascended chelas. Members of the Trilateral Commission are among the top executives from such firms as the Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, Exxon, Caterpillar Tractor Company, Coca-Cola, Hewlett-Packard, Sony, Fiat, Datsun, and Toyota. The media, labor, senators, congressmen, and educators are also well represented in the Trilateral Commission. The place that the Trilateral Commission is best represented, however, is in the executive branch of the U.S. government. The President, the Vice President, and no less than 17 others who have recently been a part of the Trilateral Commission. Former members of the TC who resigned to go into public service, quote, include Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Council advisor, Cyrus Vance, Secretary of State, W. Michael Blumenthal, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Harold Brown, Secretary of Defense, all educated by the power elite. It makes little difference whether an individual is a first-class watcher, a second or third-class watcher, or a child of God who has sold his soul to a watcher, or a laggard that was part of the sinking of Maldek, or any other evolution. It really doesn't matter where you came from as long as you're mouthing the ideology of the watchers. So it's not a witch hunt of who is who, but where the individual is aligned. That message given to Ezekiel that the wicked should be challenged and rebuked for their wickedness, else their wickedness would be upon the prophet, and that the righteous should be rebuked for their sin, and so their repentance and their survival as a soul would also be upon the head of the prophet. In other words, what God told Ezekiel, if you do not rebuke the wicked for the evil ways and expose them, then their sins are upon you. And if you do not rebuke the children of God for their unrighteousness, then their unrighteousness is upon you. That is a very hard saying. It means you can't be in a hole with the information you have. Not only do you witness to the truth, but you stand before the wicked or the disobedient children of God, and you tell them what they are doing wrong. And if they still persist in wrongdoing, then it's no longer your karma. You have done your duty. But if you fail to tell them by publishing the word, by giving lectures, by writing letters to the newspaper and your congressman, by talking to one another, if you fail to expose the lie, then the sins of the liar are counted in your karma. That's the path of initiation and the ruby ray. So whether these individuals are children of God, misguided, misaligned, and rebellious, or whether they are the original seed of the wicked, it doesn't matter. You don't have to know. You just have to know the type of vibration that comes forth from a fallen one or from the people whom he has indoctrinated. When you contact that vibration, it must be rebuked and exposed, and the individual embodying it must have the opportunity to choose this day whom he will serve. The trilateral coup of capturing the executive branch of the American government was perhaps the worst-kept secret of 1976. Articles in the respectable press joined the publications of the far right and the far left to cry conspiracy. The Atlantic Monthly published an article called The Trilateral Connection, and another called Carter Revealed He's a Rockefeller Republican. Economics professor Murray Rothbard asked, was Jimmy Carter named a member of the Trilateral Commission as soon as it was formed because Rockefeller and others wanted to hear the wisdom of an obscure Georgia governor? Were all the trilateralists in the Rockefeller Foundation and the Coca-Cola people chosen by Carter simply because he felt that they were the ablest possible people for the job? Or are there more sinister political, economic interests involved? Soon after Jimmy Carter took office, he warned us that hard times were upon us and that we were going to run right into an energy crisis if we didn't quickly adopt a national energy plan of his design. Create the problem and use it to centralize more control in the hands of the power elite. His plan was characterized by enormous taxes and massive government regulation. Not that both didn't already exist, but in this case, if passed, they would be carried to such extremes as to bring about total control by the elite. You watch every decision that he makes and you trace the decisions of the past. Knowing what I've told you today, you will see that these decisions are the implementation of one world government, international economic control, and international economy, and the fastest possible destruction of freedom in the United States of America. That's where it is. That is what he is doing. There's no question about it. And he's hurrying up so fast to be sure he gets it done while he's still in office. There are others ready to follow him to continue the process. So in the midst of his speech, it came at a moment when we were so short of energy and so dependent on foreign energy sources that the president likened our energy crisis to the moral equivalent of war. It happens that whenever there are real or contrived resource shortages, it forces a nation to seize greater control of the economy in order to cope with the shortages. This alone would be a frightening condition considering the nature of the administration in power. But what's worse, we are literally surrounded with domestic energy resources. This is another one of the entrenched lies of the power elite. They have convinced the children of the New Age movements, that the earth is shrinking, that we're running out of everything, and that the most important thing to do is somehow feed the poor and limit population, etc., etc. It's amazing that the children of the light encamped with false gurus actually believe that the earth is running out of its major resources. Well, what do we see happening in the newspapers right now? Alaska is buying full-page newspaper ads to complain that they have 20 centuries worth of energy resources, but that they are not being developed because the government is preventing the development of many of them, which it says are on federal land. The headline reads, "Alaska wants America to declare a new Independence Day." This ad, paid for by the state legislation, says that in addition to lots of oil, the state has trillions of cubic feet of natural gas and enough coal for 20 centuries. Now, why do you think the government does that? The power elite, the Trilateralist Commission, have a policy of international economic interdependence. Interdependence. It's the theme of the New Age jargon of these individuals. Now, if we were suddenly to develop our resources in Alaska, it would make the United States of America economically energy independent from all these manipulators in OPEC. Precisely what the power elite does not want: a strong, free, dynamic, independent America. That is why we're having this movement to have most of Alaska come under the protection of the federal government in the name of ecology. While we protect the wildlife, we are willing to throw away the souls of our people and the soul of our nation. And don't let me get started on the island off the coast of Alaska, actually owned by the United States, which the United States allows the Soviet Union to use as a concentration camp and as a base. That's what island? Wrangel Island. Wrangel Island. I'm sure if somehow the power elite could justify giving Alaska to the Soviet Union today, they would do it. Well, Alaska isn't the only area where the U.S. has great domestic energy deposits. We have known reserves of about 40 billion barrels of oil offshore in the Baltimore Canyon zone in the Atlantic. About another 40 billion in a rare 2 ecological zone near the Continental Divide. Both of these are not being developed due to environmental regulation and red tape. Yearly, the United States burns about 80 quads, or 80 quadrillion BTUs of all forms of energy. In pressurized zones off the Texas coast and the Gulf of Mexico, there are between 20,000 to 100,000 quads of natural gas. But most astounding, we have at least 6,000 years worth of coal. Most people believe the only way to use coal is to burn it. And we remember the olden days of the delivery of coal and all the dirt and soot and how messy it is, and maybe the oppression of coal miners, and it sounds like the worst way to go in energy. But this isn't true. Coal can be processed into crude oil or gasoline. Although the question seldom arises, why don't we turn our coal into gas? The usual answer is, we lack the technology. Patiently, petroleum engineers explain that the Germans are the leaders in coal gasification technology. This is true in one sense. But what most people don't know is that the Germans bought the technology from Standard Oil of New Jersey in the 1930s. This technology assisted German industry to an increase in its domestic oil and gas production from 300,000 tons of natural petroleum and 300,000 tons of synthetic gas annually to 6.5 million tons of oil annually, 5.5 million using the Standard Oil technology alone. From the days of John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, the legal monopolists in our political system have become ever more centralized and totalitarian in their methods. Consider for a moment the legal monopoly that was developed during the last century and perfected and enlarged upon on an ongoing basis. It was, as both Lenin and Professor Anthony C. Sutton have pointed out, the robber baron scheme of John Rockefeller, the socialist plan under a different label. The only difference between monopoly, capitalist, and socialist is merely the identity of the group controlling the power structure. We've said that earlier, we say it again, because it's your point of the conveyance of the torch of the Goddess of Liberty, the torch of illumination. Since no one can benefit from that vast amount of profit that socialism brings to those who run the enterprise, their drive must necessarily be for power and control. Thus, they need the cooperation of the state. In the Soviet Union, this takes the form of state socialism, is the Soviet Union's brand of control. In the United States, it developed as corporate socialism. Corporate socialism is nothing more complicated than the development of a political and economic relationship between corporations and government to the point where the line between the two becomes indistinct and the owners and directors of the giant corporations direct the government even though they are not elected. Through economic and political control, the monopolists can remain out of sight and yet control the policies of a nation. The success of Rockefeller's gambit depended then, as it does now, upon remaining out of sight by focusing public attention on irrelevant and superficial historical questions. Deception is the essence of the strategy. One of the key ploys was to focus public attention on the supposed historical incompatibility between capitalists and communists. Now, as we pointed out earlier, the line of attack the large business firms took was that of government regulation. As Professor Sutton pointed out, regulatory agencies are devices to use the police power of the state to shield favored industries from competition, to protect their inefficiencies, and to guarantee their profits. Consequently, those who hold the few legal monopolies of financial and industrial control profit at the expense of all others in society. Just as a little side point, I'd like to mention that everywhere I went on the media on last year's stump, I was asked, sometimes sincerely and sometimes with great condescension and rebuke by the interviewers, about churches amassing great quantities of wealth and milking the people of their supply, and the need to have them no longer be nonprofit, et cetera, et cetera. And you'd hear on talk shows the rage of the people about the dishonest ministers and pastors, et cetera. But you never heard an outrage about the multinational corporations or Rockefeller or the control of the federal government by these monopolies, or the fact that we, by the sweat of our brow, are subsidizing these monopolies and multinational corporations. The lie cannot be that concealed. There must be something more. The lie must be a national hypnotism, which I said before must be pierced by the power of the Trinity. In the Trilateral Commission, we see the most obvious and most complete marriage of the corporate socialists and the government in our nation's history. Jimmy Carter, a former member of the Trilateral Commission, in and of himself does not hold power, even though we think the President of the United States would, by definition, hold power. Instead, he administers power on behalf of others, which in this case are the financial industrial interests centered in the Trilateral Commission itself. First among equals of the Trilateral Commissioners is David Rockefeller. The Rockefeller family, as we just pointed out, has enormous holdings, not the least of which is in the oil industry. Although this is not well known, oil companies are in reality energy companies because they have holdings in coal and nuclear energy as well as gas and oil. They are also in the forefront of developing alternative energy technologies. So, since they all go back to Rockefeller or to these power elites, are they really going to develop an energy alternative that is going to bring America out of the crisis? Why, they have a track record of following those policies that will control and limit the people. Not having enough energy severely limits your mobility. And mobility is the sign of the Chila. And mobility has been all but stopped in totalitarian states. To limit how far an individual can go by plane or by car limits his ability to act for freedom. Among many other things, it destroys the economy, destroys the flow of goods and services. So by control of energy, you can pull the trigger on inflation, recession, and ultimately revolution. When do revolutions happen? Not when people decide they should happen, when the power elite decides that it suits their moment. If a revolution can come out where they have centralized more power and more authority, then they let it happen, just by a simple manipulation of Wall Street, the stock market, or the Federal Reserve. So here we find oil companies controlling alternative energy technologies. It is hard to appreciate the importance of this. I'll give you an example. Germany has very small oil deposits. Thus, without such technology as they bought from Standard Oil Company, Germany would not have had the oil and gas necessary to fight World War II. Standard Oil of New Jersey kept Germany fighting for years by giving it the technology it needed. Not only did they provide the technology, but Standard Oil subsidized the process. U.S. Ambassador to Germany William Dodd in 1936 wrote in his diary, quote, "Why did Standard Oil Company of New York send $1 million over here in December 1933 to aid the Germans in making gasoline from soft coal for war emergencies?" You start looking at that and you realize that behind Holocaust, behind the gassing of millions of Jews and the horrendous deaths of many others, is not merely the Nazis, but the people who backed the Nazis, the power elite in Standard Oil of New Jersey. That was in preparation for a real war, not the moral equivalent thereof. But if we do not develop our existing resources with a technology developed by an ostensibly American firm over 40 years ago, will we be just as surely defeated as if it had been an obvious war, as opposed to an unseen war? Why aren't we using that technology today? Has Standard Oil lost the recipe? Well, if they have, Fluor Corporation, located in Southern California near San Diego, is right at this time building 3 or 4 plants for coal gasification in South Africa for the South African government. They will make crude oil out of coal. The South Africans are quite pleased with this technology. For one thing, it's cheaper than nuclear energy. This is more than a little odd. In the United States, our energy companies can develop any of their resources. At present, the corporate investment in nuclear energy is about $100 billion. Some believe that we are sticking with nuclear energy to preserve our investment, despite the dangers. There's no doubt in my mind that those who defend the safety of nuclear power plants here in California, where we have fault upon fault and danger of earthquake all the time, there's no question in my mind that the fallen ones in the energy companies who have invested $100 billion in these power plants are going to keep on saying that they're safe until they've gotten all of their money out of those plants. And that may take many, many years. Then there's another group of people, ironically, many people in the right wing of America, who are certain that the attack on the nuclear power plants is all a conspiracy, and they are the ones who are saying they're safe, 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 right in the face of 3 Mile Island. Well, I don't believe we should have nuclear power plants because I don't know who can guarantee this nation anywhere against cataclysm. Do you remember when they shut down a plant in New England because they said it couldn't stand an earthquake, and after they shut it down, lo and behold, New England had an earthquake? That happened just this year. We have enough coal in the United States and Alaska to transmute, if you will, to change into oil to solve all of our oil energy problems. We should do it today. We should write our dynamic decrees in this next 2-week period. We should meet. We should plan our strategies under the World Teacher for getting out that information. We need groups of people who are going to supplement the work of the messenger and do the research necessary so that there are no loopholes. It's possible that I have made a mistake in this research, or that committees have made mistakes in their research who have helped me. If we're going to publish, and if we're going to demonstrate, and if we're going to expose, we have to be responsible for every fact and figure and not be left vulnerable to criticism. If you come bearing the standard of the Ascended Masters and the Great White Brotherhood, you need a clean sword, and you need to be able to back your word and know the whole history from beginning to end. You have to become an expert on oil, on coal, on nuclear energy. Keepers of the flame who are in these fields around America, I invite you to come to Camelot and form a department at Summit University on energy. We need it, and we need it now. And if you don't have any background in the field and you're ready to go to college, you might consider it, because the world is hanging on this manipulation of forces in the Arab world and OPEC, and it promises to do only one thing, and that is to get worse. And the Arabs justify their raising of crude oil prices on the basis that the dollar is becoming worth less and less. Well, those who make the dollar worth less and less have the same goal as OPEC, to have an international, interdependent economy and to level the United States and make her less than an equal on the world stage when she should be the leader and the shepherd nation of all. So for any other reasons than the safety of our people and the safety into the new age, I am interested in having all nuclear power plants shut down, because I don't trust the people running them, the people designing them, the people regulating them, the people that aren't there that should be guarding them from sabotage by enemies. I don't trust their ability to hold a flame or keep the flame around that much intense energy of alpha and omega. I'm too much aware of this generation of people who have had drugs, and I know the fallibility of their response mechanisms. I also know the fallibility of the designs and of the computers. And if all else goes well and they function well, what happens in Cataclysm when the earth is polluted for the next how many thousands of years? Because Cataclysm itself has exposed the power plant and its radioactivity to the elements, to the earth, and to whole populations. I don't think that the people of this planet have enough maturity on the path of initiation to handle nuclear energy, and I don't believe the Great White Brotherhood desires us to turn to it for peaceful uses. We have solar power, we have the conversion of coal and natural gas, and we have the untapped power of the sea itself. The ocean itself is an enormous focal point of energy. So that is my reason. And it doesn't go along with all of the reasons of other people that are demonstrating against the power plants. But for whatever reason, we have enough of a powder keg of the arsenals of nuclear weapons than to create a further point of vulnerability on our soil and the soils of nations. There's one thing about the fallen ones that you must understand, that as long as they are free and in the earth and able to amass power and enjoy it, they keep the earth running, and they keep the children of God as their slaves. But you know, the final judgment comes for them, and it's coming quickly. And in the final end, the last hours and days or century of their existence, it no longer matters if you keep the earth spinning. It no longer really matters if the whole thing blows up, because the rationale of these fallen ones is they're going to the last judgment. They pass to the second death. So when they've had their fun and enjoyed the planet for thousands of years at the expense of the light bearers, there's that moment of insanity, that moment of total cutting off from the heart or the feelings, when anyone among them could be the one that pulls the trigger, pulls the cord on massive explosions or nuclear war or the upset of power plants or whatever. It's like the madness of an Adolf Hitler. He is ready to destroy to gain power. And it reaches a point where the black magician becomes absolutely insane. Insanity in its first degree is the denial of God, Christ incarnate, and to desire to live outside of the Guru-Chela relationship. But it's in its end finality, insanity, is the willingness to destroy everything because you yourself are being destroyed. That is the equation that I see in nuclear energy and power plants. I simply don't trust the earth in its present state to handle it. I champion your right to disagree with me. I want you to always remember that. I tell you what I believe and why I believe it, and if you believe something else and you have better reasons, I wish you'd tell me. Write and tell me so I have documentation in my files, because I'm always ready to learn from Chelas, from anyone. You know, Moria's motto is, if the messenger be an ant, heed him. And how do you know the ant is a messenger? By the word that he speaks, by the vibration. If the vibration is truth, accept it, no matter whose mouth it comes out of, because God works in mysterious and wondrous ways. So if a Chela corrects me on an opinion, I am most grateful. I am most grateful. Getting on with the trilateralists, they are internationalists. That means they have no loyalties to the group karma of the children of God that manifests as the nations of the earth. They are dedicated to building a world order and are not exclusively loyal to the United States or the American way of life. The American way of life is the way of the I am race. Nor are they loyal to any idea which would involve the average person in the decision-making process or acknowledge that he had any power or intelligence at all. Characteristic of that type of thinking is Zbigniew Brzezinski, our National Security Council advisor, who wrote that the American political system was based on assumptions that are increasingly becoming irrelevant, in that the representative system of government should be replaced by some sort of computing and planning society outside the legislative process that would separate the political system from society. Separate the political system from society. Well, political, the word politics comes in its root meaning the people, right in the early Greek states, the people being responsible for their self-government. Brzezinski foresaw a time in which social crises might arise that would make it necessary for us to have a technocratic dictatorship which would arise as power gravitated into the hands of those who are able to control and correlate information most rapidly, thereby enabling them to respond to the rapid pace of change. Among other things, Brzezinski would like to alter or replace the Constitution. In case you have not heard me say it, the Constitution is a divine document of the Holy Trinity, inspired by Saint Germain upon the Founding Fathers, and its implementation, the implementation of the Trinity, depends on the rising mother flame in the children of God in America. They supply the mother flame, it supplies the Trinity. In Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, he wrote, "The approaching 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence could justify the call for a national constitutional convention to re-examine the nation's formal institutional framework. Either 1976 or 1989, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution could serve as a suitable target date culminating a national dialogue on the relevance of existing arrangements. Realism, however, forces us to recognize that the necessary political innovation will not come from direct constitutional reform, desirable as that would be. The needed change is more likely to develop incrementally and less overtly, under the table, in other words, in keeping with the American tradition of lessening distinctions between public and private institutions." Did you all know what he just said? He said we shouldn't be so obvious about throwing out the Constitution. It should gradually evolve to change in keeping with this tradition, which he calls American, of the lessening of distinctions between public and private institutions. That's not an American tradition, it's the tradition of the fallen ones. The question, was the monopoly type of capitalist development inevitable? Both Lenin and Karl Marx said that it was. In his 3-volume work, Das Kapital, Karl Marx tried to explain the dynamics or the laws of motion of capitalism. In essence, he saw capitalism as one stage in the history of civilization which had forces inherent within it, contradictions that would unalterably, scientifically bring about its collapse. The only contradictions in capitalism are the presence of the fallen ones within the free market economy. Marx believed that the forces of social change did not proceed from ideas, but from the society's economic life and conflict between social classes. Societies past and present consisted of but 2 classes, the ruling class and the toiling, oppressed class. This class distinction was a constant factor in all previous societies. All the while that civilization marched forward from primitive communism to slave states, to feudalism, to capitalism, which it did because the mode of production changed, which in turn altered the cultural superstructure of society, class distinctions always remained. Yet, to understand the dynamics of a capitalist society a la Marx, it is necessary to examine his theory of value and surplus value. As one of my favorite friends remarked recently, Marx was a ninny. You're going to hear how he's a ninny in these theories. Marx borrowed the labor theory of value from Adam Smith. In essence, it simply states that all value is produced by labor. This theory holds that the value of a commodity is equal to the work that went into it. If a suit of clothes takes twice as much labor to make as a purse, then suits will sell for twice the price of purses. The capitalist and the worker were, according to Marx, enemies by historical and economic necessity. The worker was a free agent who entered the market to dispose of the one commodity he commands, labor power. The capitalist was an entrepreneur trapped in an endless race against other entrepreneurs against whom he was compelled by the force of competition to accumulate enough capital to stay in business. If he didn't, his business would fail and his bankrupt operation would be purchased by another, but financially stronger capitalist. The law of survival was accumulate or be accumulated. Therein lies the rub. Under these circumstances, Marx wondered, how could a capitalist accumulate? Logically only from his profits. But could profits spring spontaneously from capital? No. The idea of something being created out of nothing was unacceptable to human reason, Marx wrote. It is inexplicable that more value should come out of production than went into it, for something cannot come out of nothing. Marx was sure, moreover, that no capitalist would dare raise his price above the competitive one. Under the circumstances, how could profit exist? This presented a contradiction. Profits might be explainable if there were monopolies in the system which could circumvent the leveling influence of competition, or if it was assumed that capitalists paid labor less than their worth. But Marx did not accept either of these propositions. Instead, he states that it will be pure capitalism, free trade, which will be the origin of his analysis and which, because of its contradictions, will proceed to its grave. The development of modern industry, he proclaimed in the Communist Manifesto, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeois produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeois produces above all are its own gravediggers. The laws of motion move the capitalist economy forward like this, Marx explains. The laborer will sell his product, his labor power, for what it is worth, much like the capitalist. From Marx's point of view, this turns out to be the exact amount of money required to keep that laborer alive, a subsistence wage. The laborer can ask no more. If a worker is not willing to work a full day, he doesn't get a job. However, like everyone else, he has no right and no power to ask for more than his worth as a commodity. In Marx's eyes, this system is perfectly equitable, with the one exception that all the workers are cheated because they are forced to work longer than it takes to earn their own sustenance. If we assume for a moment that it takes 6 hours of society's labor to maintain a working man and the price of labor is $1 an hour, then a working man is worth $6 a day and no more. But a laborer who gets a job works for more than 6 hours a day. He might work for 8 or 10 hours worth of value, yet will only be paid for 6. His wage will cover his sustenance, which is his true value and which is all that he's really entitled to. But the capitalist gets the money for the extra hours he has worked but hasn't been paid for, the surplus value or profit. This, according to Marx, is how profits enter the system, through the sweat of the brow of the laborer. Surplus value equals both profit and exploitation. The capitalist forced to work for profits is by definition an exploiter. This is the basis of the class struggle. Now you know why Marx is a ninny. The capitalist is forced by the system to do this, however. He is merely obeying the laws which require him to stay even with his competitors. When wages rise, as they inevitably do, he must introduce labor-saving machinery to cut his costs and thereby maintain his rate of profit. If he doesn't, his neighbor will, and as a result, he will develop a competitive edge. It is suicidal for a capitalist to allow a competitor to get ahead, but when he does substitute machinery for labor, it narrows the base from which he can extract profit, and he finds himself thus on the horns of a dilemma. The capitalist is forced to substitute a non-profitable means of production, machines, for a profitable one, workers. It's only labor, not machinery, that will produce value, says Marx. In Marx's theory, when a capitalist buys a machine, he pays full value for it. If the machine costs $1,000, it will never produce for him more than $1,000 worth of value. It is only from living labor that a capitalist can realize a profit, and that from the unpaid hours of surplus work time. It's almost unbelievable to believe that someone could sit down at a table and think up this theory, and that all kinds of people ever since could believe in it as some kind of a metaphysical reality. It is only from living labor that a capitalist can realize a profit, and that from the unpaid hours of surplus work time. Therefore, whenever the capitalist reduces the number or proportion of workers he employs, he is in effect killing the goose that lays the golden egg. But this is exactly what he does. Furthermore, consumption declines as machines displace men, and the number of employed workers fails to keep pace with the output. Bankruptcies ensue, and a capitalist's crisis is at hand. Smaller firms go under, and workers are thrown out of work. Machinery sold on the market by bankrupt capitalists is purchased by the stronger capitalists for less than their true value, and then once again, after a time, surplus value, i.e. profits, appear, and the capitalist ship of state seems to right itself again. But it does so only to repeat the same crisis of competition, high wages, acquisition of machinery, replacing labor, the decline of surplus value, frenzied competition, and crisis. Each crisis is successively worse than the preceding one. All of this proceeds with dialectical certainty until the breakdown, which is inevitable. As a result of the capitalist crisis, Marx postulated that overproduction in capitalist countries would lead them to search for foreign markets, colonies, where investments in foreign trade would yield higher rates of profit. It was possible to earn higher profits in foreign markets because capitalists could compete in a less highly developed environment against inferior competitors and thereby yield higher levels of profits while also exploiting the availability of slavery or forms of feudalism which might be available in backward societies. The colonies would become by necessity captive markets for capitalist overproduction. This is the theoretical origin of imperialism. Finally, as machinery replaced labor, commodities would become cheaper and large concentrations of capital would drive out smaller ones. This would lead to the centralization and concentration of capital because of the advantages of size and competition among producers. As a consequence of centralization, fewer and fewer laborers would be employed. The growth of monopoly would reduce the demand for labor, and ultimately capitalism would create increasingly severe economic depressions. They would be accompanied by massive misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. This would cause a revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. Said Marx, centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. That was a favorite word of Marx, the integument. It means a covering. This integument bursts asunder. The knell of the capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. Now, Marx has endless statements such as these. Are his theories true? No, he makes several fundamental errors. First of all, the labor theory of value, which he borrowed from Adam Smith, is false. Smith said that labor alone, therefore, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. Marx incorporated a second erroneous concept, one which came from economist David Ricardo, who said, "The natural price of labor is that price which is necessary to enable laborers to subsist and perpetuate the race without either increase or diminution." History has proven both of these theories to be untrue, yet Marx's entire economic analysis is built on them. Can it be true that a worker is bound by natural law to a subsistence wage? During Marx's early years, the idea might have seemed plausible. But even in Marx's time, workers lived at more than a subsistence level. Then there is the premise that since labor is the only source of value, when there is an increase in wealth, all increase must rightfully belong to labor. Therefore, the rich get rich at the expense of the poor. This is true only if labor is defined in a very narrow sense, including only those who did physical work. Other people contribute to the good of society in ways great or small, doing work and producing wealth, and therefore must in the broadest sense be considered labor. A philosopher who does nothing more than conceive of a better way for all to live is creating conditions for all others to produce more wealth. Even though he may not have lifted a finger, he has in essence done work. Should he not be compensated, even though his contribution may be rather intangible? But Marx had yet another weakness, a misunderstanding of profit. In the days of a barter economy, men could exchange item for item. This was direct exchange, and presumably both parties were happy. In a money economy, people exchanged goods for money and then exchanged the money for other goods or services. This is called indirect exchange. Marx's basic idea was that a fair exchange existed only when someone took a commodity to the market, exchanged it for another of equal value in money, and then exchanged this money for another equal value of another commodity he wanted. This is what he considered was a fair, indirect exchange. Capitalists did not do this. They made a profit which he thought was unfair. Some of the value which he believed had been produced by labor was being extracted by the capitalist. However, Marx does not take into consideration the subjective theory of value, which states simply that values exist in men's minds. Value is not objective, it is subjective. We value things based on our perception of their ability to satisfy some want or need that we have. Different men have different value scales. Furthermore, the same men have different value scales at different times. Consequently, the values of goods are constantly changing because their subjective worth to any individual or a group of individuals is continually changing. Look at the price of gasoline. When you can't get anywhere, you're willing to pay any price. When it's plentiful, you'll shop for the lowest price. Who would have ever thought we would have said gasoline is worth $1.10 a gallon to us? Well, it's worth it if you want to get somewhere and your mission is more important than $1.10 a gallon. You buy the gas and you get there. This is true with everything we have. Some people would pay $100 for a book by the Ascended Masters. Some people wouldn't pay anything. For everyone, the value is different, and everyone has a right to value things differently and to be willing to pay the price that he feels something is worth. If we examine mankind's behavior, we will find out that only men with different value scales can and do exchange for mutual advantage. In other words, no one will enter into a transaction unless he believes that from his point of view, he is going to come out ahead. He will exchange something he has for something that is more valuable to him. In every market transaction, when one individual improves his situation, he is doing it with another party who is also improving his situation, barring force, fraud, or human error. In a free market, there is no use of force. If you have $25 and you want to buy a pair of shoes, you do so because shoes are worth more to you than $25. And the individual who is selling the shoes is likewise willing to make the trade because $25 is more value to him than the pair of shoes. All free market transactions are exchanges of two sets of assets in which each set of assets moves from those who place a lower value on it to those who place a higher value on it. All people can be enriched by each exchange. If we add but one more dimension, we can eliminate the last theoretical objection to profits, which is this: men have the ability to produce more and more wealth on a regular and ongoing basis. New wealth is the reservoir for profit. In a free market, as an individual produces wealth, and contributes to the society, he gains greater and greater personal wealth because he is rewarded for his contribution. What Marx was arguing against is the right of the individual to take the threefold flame of his heart and use it in the sacred labor to multiply his abundance, to multiply his substance. Marx would have told Jesus he had no right to multiply the bread and the fishes. He had no right to realize a profit by the handiwork of his hands. This "be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth" is not only the bringing forth of more children, it's the multiplication of God consciousness in more goods, more services, and better services. Marx was actually recommending a static economy, refusing that the individual who has designed or created or invented and who takes the responsibility of production, refusing to admit that that individual has a right to a profit. If he has increased the well-being of others by thinking up electricity or thinking up this or that, he has a right to a measure of profit. But the market, the free market economy, and the path of initiation was never geared to allow the accumulation of the great fortunes that arose in America and throughout the world. These were made by the violation of the free market, by the restriction of competition. It was the tying of the hands behind their backs of the creative sons and daughters of God in this and every nation. These were made by the violation of the market, by the restriction of competition, which made it possible for the few individuals to exploit the many. Nevertheless, Marx's understanding of capitalism was not an analysis of the principles of the free market, but was predicated on a profound misunderstanding of economics and on his observations of the monopolists. As political scientist Robert Wesson has pointed out, the predictions made or implied by Marx have nearly all been falsified by history. The middle class, whom Marx marked for extinction, increased with industrial maturity. Economic crises did not become progressively worse, nor did the expected revolution come in the industrial nations. Despite the obvious difficulties during the Industrial Revolution and the bad treatment of workers on the part of some of the factory owners as a class, the new capitalists, who at that time were a very small group, formed a far more productive and less parasitic upper class than many of the nobles and landlords. Frequently, the capitalists were hard-working, sometimes greedy, but often aesthetic and devoted entrepreneurs, often of humble origins. What's more, the new factory towns also gave employment to a surplus labor force which had been growing in the countryside, and to impoverished vagrants who were recruited to work in the looms and mills. Those were tumultuous times, a literal changeover from the old order to the new, the process of the Piscean age giving way to the age of Aquarius and all of its science and technology that comes through the hand of Saint Germain. The chaos, the hurried pace, the black smoke belching from factories which were often constructed with little regard for pleasure or health contributed to the general discomfort of the time. The growing population ate up much of the new wealth from productivity, and the new tedious and grinding system of labor made every socialist thinker, Marx included, think about the sweet life of the good old days. The central theme at the heart of Marxism is a protest against Western-style industrialization and his perception of its caustic effects: inequality, dehumanization, oppression, destruction of human values, and the degradation of people. But despite the hardships, history has shown that the woes of factory workers were a temporary phenomenon, especially in the developed nations where they have practically become a privileged class. Nevertheless, Marx detested the bourgeois order. He detested the children of God who would rise in their soul attainment, realize they could elect to become adopted sons by redemption, move into those positions of hierarchy, of sonship, of the authority of the Christ incarnate, and ultimately overthrow the conspirators of both communism and capitalism. His hatred of this bourgeoisie that he constantly refers to is his hatred of the children of God. He was inconsistent about everything else. His inconsistency became the wellspring of his strength, however. For what Marx was developing was not really an economic theory or an explanation of the movements of history, but rather an intellectual battering ram against the new Western industrial capitalist who was upsetting his world. It gave him the flexibility to state absurdities with great authority. For example, in Das Kapital, he proclaims, "A working day of a given length always creates the same amount of value, no matter how much the productiveness of labor, and with it the mass of the product and the price of each single commodity produced may vary." He developed this idea to the point where his contention was that wages actually decrease as production increases and the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. There are individuals who have a hatred for God and his offspring who are looking for an intellectual, metaphysical, even occult, political, economic theory that they can become erudite in. They are jamming the universities of the world. Marxist teachers are in the seats of authority. They train their students in Marxism, who become either perpetual students or teachers themselves, and they embody these theories of Marx today all across America, all across the African nations, and they don't lift a hand to become part of the working force of the nations to infuse the nation with the love of the Holy Spirit that comes through work. They are the theorists who are always ready to defend the disgruntled people who want something for nothing and want to live off the state. So, as contradictory and as foolish as these theories seem, they are held by intellectuals the world over today who believe in them with a religious zeal. If you don't believe that he said these things, go back to these books and wade through them. The reason that children of light don't confer and speak the jargon or the lingo of the Marxists is that it's such an intense experience to wade through this, and it's so obviously unreal that you cast the whole thing aside instead of learning enough of it to talk with the children of light who are imprisoned by the belief system. Marx was accomplished in the art of verbal manipulation, as was the serpent in the garden. He left a virtual arsenal of slogans and epithets for his followers to hurl at the enemy. But above all, Marx left a theory which had two graces which rescued it from historical obscurity. One, it had something for everyone, and two, most of his writings are unintelligible. According to a prominent socialist, Das Kapital owes much to its indigestible length, its hermetic style, its ostentatious erudition, and its algebraical mysticism. When studying Marx, it's possible to argue endlessly over just what he really meant, or to counter any criticism or interpretation with the words of Marx. Contained within his message, there is democracy and authoritarianism, individualism and theories for their reintegration into the social whole, determinism and voluntarism, materialism or idealism, freedom, discipline, you name it. Virtually anything could be Marxism. As Sidney Hook noted, no program of action was so foreign that it could not be brought under Marxian formulas. Why? Because the ends always justify the means, so you can champion any political philosophy if it's going to serve your means of the moment. To Marx, the proletariat was merely an instrument with which to remake society, regardless of the effect it might have on real workers. Neither Marx nor Engels were interested in the poor. They were the false hierarchs, the impostors, the hireling of whom Jesus Christ spoke. They come pretending to be the shepherds of the people, but when the wolf comes, they flee. They do not defend or care for the sheep. In the Communist Manifesto, they were called the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest leaders of old society. In 1849, Gottschalk, a German socialist, said that Marxists are not earnest about the salvation of the oppressed. The distress of the workers, the hunger of the poor, have only a scientific, doctrinaire interest for them. In other words, they serve their ends of amalgamating power. In fact, Marx practically opposed a 10-hour workday bill proposed in 1850. In essence, he preferred to have children exploited in the factory with the hope that in the future they would become better revolutionaries. They were working 12, 14 longer hours a day. Here comes a proposal for a 10-hour workday, and he opposes it because he wants the children to be oppressed so that later he can use them in the revolution. A general prohibition of child labor, he wrote, is incompatible with the existence of large-scale industry, which of course was something Marx supported. Engels had the same outlook. In 1847, he thought it necessary to welcome the potato blight, which brought starvation to millions because it shook the established order. And Marx opposed the emancipation of serfs in Russia on the grounds that if they were emancipated, it would weaken the autocratic state which he favored. Now, if the serfs were emancipated, then he would have no reason for a revolution, a socialist revolution. If the monarchy of Russia was allowed to bring in its reforms, as it had begun to do, there would no longer be any cause for a socialist revolution. So the theory of Marx, Engels, was to increase the oppression of the masses and bring it to a fever pitch so that they would revolt. It almost seemed as if Marx was an anti-Marxist. Perhaps he was. But in the 1870s, he dismissed his followers who were intoxicated by the rhetoric and hyperbole of his own words. All I know, he said, is that I am not a Marxist. Marx had become a reformist. In his inaugural address at the First International, Marx acknowledged the strength of capitalism and acclaimed the advances made by legislation, including the 10-hour workday. By the time he wrote the third volume of Das Kapital, he totally abandoned the prediction of falling rates of profit, and under the weight of the events of modern history, he considerably watered down the theory of surplus value from whence all exploitation proceeded. Furthermore, he recognized that it was managers and not capitalists who stood at the soul of our industrial system. By the time Marx wrote out one of his last important works, the Critique of the Gotha Program, he rejected numerous other ideas with which he had once been associated, including the idea that labor is the source of all wealth and all value, or that labor was entitled to the full product. History had been proceeding on a course entirely different than he had imagined. Even Engels, who had reshaped the entire doctrine to make it stronger and more suitable for the politics of the day, stated that factors other than economic played a part in history. Marx and I, he wrote, are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that younger writers sometimes lay more stress on the economy than is due to it. We had to emphasize this main principle in opposition to our adversaries who denied it. And we had always not the time, the place, or the opportunity to allow the other elements involved in the interaction to come to the right. By the end of his life, Marx was no longer anticipating a revolution in the industrialized West and vaguely hoped or expected that something like socialism would come about by a peaceful and democratic process. Marx placed his final hopes for a violent revolution in pre-capitalist Russia, where there had been what he believed was a promising upsurge of terrorism. This general disproof and abandonment of Marxism by Marxists leads to several compelling questions. How is it that Marx and Lenin were so prophetically accurate about the behavior of the monopolists? It would have been impossible to derive the information from their theories, which were faulty. Therefore, there was only one other method that could yield such a clear operational description of the monopolists: self-analysis. Marx and Lenin on the one hand and the capitalists on the other were both monopolists. They had three important traits in common. One, an insatiable thirst for power and control. Two, a similar philosophical base, atheism. Most of the monopoly capitalists were humanists, a man-centered, materialistic philosophy of the universe which denies the existence of God. Marx said in his Économie politique et philosophie that humanism is the denial of God and the total affirmation of man. Humanism is really nothing else but Marxism. In essence, the capitalists and the communists, as well as the fascists, are all the same breed of cat. The third point, first, the thirst for power; second, the atheism; third, the actions they take are identical. They create exactly the same kind of structures, totalitarian forms of government with centralized economic planning. They evolve a very elaborate mythology, a religion as it were, to explain why their system works and why other totalitarian systems do not, and are able to find sufficient means of gaining a certain element of credence for their own brand of political religion. Weaknesses found in other totalitarian systems are used as proof that their own brand of totalitarianism is best. Communists, monopoly capitalists, and fascists are all playing the same game. In order to clarify this seeming contradiction, which is due only to the multitude of labels, let's examine the case of monopolization in the United States. Today, observers from right to left have seen the vast concentration of economic and political forces in America. These combined financial empires, which can be identified with the Trilateral Commission, the Rockefeller Empire, the Morgan Empire, and so on, appear to have a different organizational structure depending on the observer's point of reference. Observers on the left have called America monopoly capitalists, imperialists, or fascists, while observers on the right have tended to call these big businessmen socialists. Both are right. The confusion in the matter about what form of system this is stems from a fact which most people overlook. Simply stated, monopoly capitalism, communism, socialism, and fascism, despite minor nuances which make them appear different, are in essence the same thing. If we were to try to delineate the differences between communism and fascism, we would say that fascism is a totalitarian way of organizing an advanced industrial society, and communism is a totalitarian way of organizing a relatively primitive industrial society. Both have the common features of centralized economy and the use of police power to enforce the methods of organization. Political control is authoritarian rather than voluntary. Participatory democracy and political representation disappear, and the government directs all phases of activity. A dictator or ruling oligarchy is established. Whether the power is vested in a Politburo, a Führer, or trilateralists, the symmetry or the ratio and relationship of the rulers to the society is the same. The direct rulers are surrounded by a ruling class. In America, it is called the power elite. In the Soviet Union or China, the new class. It is characterized by its collective control and ownership of the major institutions of society. The Soviets, in order to keep their own society afloat, have appropriated arbitrarily vast quantities of wealth from satellite nations. Richard Barnett points out the Soviets forced the Eastern European countries to buy their raw materials at unofficially high prices. Trade officials in Bulgaria in 1949 and in Czechoslovakia in 1962 were executed for anti-Soviet and nationalist behavior because they objected to the terms the Soviets imposed. At the same time, the export prices of the Soviet Union's reluctant trading partners were set too low. Those same policies still exist today. Besides sharing a similar economic organization, monopolistic systems have a tendency to engage in continual cooperation and in conflict. Détente between the United States and the Soviet Union is a perfect example of this. However, in order to appreciate this entire phenomena, let's go back to the Soviet Union when it was just a fledgling nation. Whereas it is widely known that the Germans assisted Lenin to return to Russia, it is less well known that Woodrow Wilson made it possible for Leon Trotsky to enter Russia with an American passport, despite the efforts of the British police to halt him. The aid given by Western capitalists, i.e. monopolists, particularly Americans, is astounding. William Boyce Thompson, a banker and a director of the Federal Reserve Bank at New York City, gave the Bolsheviks $1 million of his own money during the Russian Revolution to assist them to carry out their plans. At the same time, in conjunction with Trotsky's People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, he set up a propaganda network in Russia to aid the Bolsheviks. Jacob Schiff of the banking house of Kuhn and Loeb is reported to have given Lenin $20 million in gold. The Warburgs of Germany and the Rothschilds of England have also provided financial aid. When food was scarce, the elite sent food to the Soviet Union. Without financial aid and, more important, the diplomatic support by the New York elite, the Bolsheviks may well have withered away in Russia. In return, however, the international capitalists had secured a near monopoly on the world's largest untapped market, Russia, and Russia was a desperate customer. This is why the Western nations, their representatives, turned their backs, did not afford asylum to the Tsar and his family, did not prevent the destruction of that form of government because they anticipated their tremendous income from a Russia that was leveled by revolution. Many of the earlier purchases were placed on an emergency basis. For example, the Morris Company of Chicago sold $50 million worth of food products to Russia in 1920. The value of Western assistance was vital to the success of the revolution. Said Lenin, without the assistance of capital, it will be impossible for us to retain proletarian power. And Trotsky was quoted as saying, what we need here is an organizer like Bernard M. Baruch, a corporate socialist of the highest degree. That's my comment. Lest the hand-in-glove relationship between the big businessmen on Wall Street and the Bolsheviks be overlooked, Max May, vice president of Guarantee Trust Company, became a director of Ruscombank, the Soviets' first bank, even though it was illegal to do so. Like Lenin before him, Stalin recognized the value of American help in building the revolution. He said that 2/3 of all large Soviet enterprises were built with United States help. Professor Anthony Sutton has noted that 90 to 95% of all Soviet technology came from the United States and its allies. Despite the weaknesses of the Soviet economy, which in plain terms does not constitute a viable system, the Soviets have been able to build an incredibly powerful military-industrial complex and the most powerful armed forces in the world. Commenting on this, Anthony Sutton said, "We have built ourselves an enemy. Without American assistance, this could never have happened." The net effect of this aid is that 100,000 Americans killed in Korea and Vietnam were killed with armaments transported on propulsion systems we ourselves supplied. 71 out of 95 ships used by the Soviets to supply North Vietnam had engines built outside of Russia in the West. Furthermore, trucks used by the communists during the war were built in huge factories located in the Soviet Union, which were constructed by U.S. truck and auto firms such as Ford and International Harvester. It's no wonder that the children of the light rebelled against the war in Vietnam. They knew it was a manipulated war, a war for one purpose: to gain greater control and centralization of power, and to destroy the youth, the children of God, to milk them of their light in a bloodbath. That bloodbath, as you know, has continued in Vietnam and Cambodia, and the complete upheaval of their societies, and now the problem of refugees, thousands upon thousands of refugees fleeing the hand of world communism backed by world capitalism. Things are still the same today. When grain gets short, the United States sells the Soviet Union huge shipments under extremely favorable terms, paid for by Americans as their prices are raised to make up the difference. If the Soviets are short on technology, we always supply them. Some of the more shocking sales were the 35 Centilin B machines sold to the Soviets by the Bryant Chucking Grinder Company. The machines produced miniature ball bearings which made possible the Soviet MIRVing of their missiles, despite the objections of Congress which called the sale a life and death matter. The sale was approved by the watcher Robert McNamara. Another recent case involved a strategic computer capable of 40 million operations per second, enough to neutralize our entire strategic bomber force. Control Data Corporation wanted to sell the Soviets the Cyber 76 system, one of the most advanced in the world. But President Carter vetoed the deal after the American public got wind of the sale and strongly protested. Among the protesters were students of Montessori International who wrote directly to the firm who manufactured the system as well as to their congressman. Perhaps the most outrageous part of the support given by our country to the Soviet Union is that our bankers have provided over $40 billion in loans to the Russians to finance these technology transfers and the purchases of our grain. And of course, at any moment, the Soviet Union could simply declare, we will no longer repay these loans, and then the house of cards of Wall Street would come tumbling down. And therefore, it is in the interest of the international bankers to secure every possible favor through our government and Congress for the Soviet Union so that they will remain in a good mood and keep paying back their debts to the banks. This is the case of the Panama Canal giveaway. It is the bankers loaning the government of Panama money, the money not being paid back, and therefore the international bankers looking to the American people to subsidize the canal, given to the Marxist Omar Torrijos, and thus to save its own neck by the turning over of the Panama Canal. It's the bankers in New York who manipulated the giveaway of the canal. The Ascended Masters oppose it because it's the nexus of light of the flow of energy in the hemisphere from north to south over the figure-8 flow of the Buddha and the Mother, and the canal is the nexus. The nexus must be a tremendous focus of light to guard not only the canal, but freedom in all of Central America. You see Omar Torrijos supplying guns, along with Fidel Castro, to the Sandinistas, the Liberation Front, coming in to liberate Nicaragua from the imperialist. Instead, we need sons and daughters of God to liberate Nicaragua and every nation from the guerrillas sponsored by the communists and from those who have taken advantage of the free market economy. Now, having built up the Soviet Union into our most formidable enemy, we now appear to be ready to do the same to communist China. Headlines today in the LA Times talk about the loans being secured for communist China so that they can begin immediately to trade with us in the West. And of course, it's been shown again and again that Red China really doesn't have anything that we want or need. But we have everything that they need, and therefore the loan is taking the money of the American people. Our money becomes of less and less value because more and more money is created out of nothing. You get more and more money, so the money in your hand relative to the whole is worth less and less. You get less and less of the piece of the pie of real wealth in America. And this happens so that the American people, the light bearers, can subsidize the watchers in communist China. Furthermore, the Wall Street financiers financed the corporate structure that supported the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. Hermann Schmitz, the architect of IG Farben, a mammoth German cartel that at once provided the economic strength for the German war machine and the political support that Hitler needed to bring him to power, borrowed millions of dollars from Dillon Reed and Company, as well as other Wall Street firms. IG Farben entered into many cartel agreements with numerous big American businesses, including Standard Oil of New Jersey and DuPont. Rockefeller's Chase Bank maintained friendly relations with the Nazis throughout World War II, as did German General Electric. Our General Electric Corporation even managed to have the German General Electric plants spared from strategic bombing during World War II, even though there is little question about their strategic advantage to the enemy. The power of the international elite. While the blood and sweat of Americans, the whole nation in a national emergency for the war effort, people working in factories making sacrifices, and the internationalists in IG Farben, in the General Electric Company, are subsidizing the war in Nazi Germany. Why? Because the watchers make money off of war. They make money off of munitions plants. They make money over everything that is bought and sold to further the war, and they further concentrate power. It is to their advantage to create war. The inner reasons are that the massive bloodshed of the children of God exposes the blood. The blood runs. The blood is the carrier of the light of the Christ consciousness of the people. The blood of Christ is in his seed. The seed of God are the children of God. They carry the light in their very bodies. When their blood is shed, the astral hordes, the vultures, the demons, the discarnates, come to those bodies and drink up the light, thereby perpetuating their existence. All those who have been cut off from God are vampires, whether they're in embodiment or out of embodiment, and they have to have a source of light. This is why death is a part of world communism, why there must be war and continual bloodshed. Those in embodiment live off that energy. And if you listen to my previous lectures on Marx and socialism and the death cult, I've explained this very process of Satanism in Marxism. And this is the core of the reason, the release of the energy of the children of God. Today, one of the most blatant examples of cooperation and competition between the elites of the competing totalitarian systems is the case of Gulf oil in Angola. As you all remember, there was recently a so-called civil war in Angola, where the communists seized control of the government with the help of friendly Cuban soldiers. Typically, during a communist takeover of this kind, there are various byplays that go on between the opposing leaders of the major power bloc, the US and the Soviet Union, that are seldom seen but are of great importance. The communists brand the actions of the capitalists as imperialist. Their allegations are often quite true. The imperialists feel guilty about their actions, perhaps, but at the same time, they identify with the invading forces which represent world communism because they are aware that the communists will set up a form of government that they would also establish given the opportunity, a totalitarian form of government. The Cubans played a decisive role in the Angola fight, helping to defeat the pro-Western or the pro-freedom guerrillas. The leaders, the key leader in Angola, is a son of light, I am told, by Adolphus in Liberia. He is in constant touch with him, and this leader, who is still leading those forces, has called again and again for me and for you to support the movement of freedom in Angola with our prayers. You will remember that it was about July Freedom Class 1976 that Angola came to a head, and you remember the outrage of beloved Arcturus and the Ascended Masters, that Angola represented the first of many subsequent instances where the United States government has not lifted a hand to help the pro-freedom forces from guerrilla activities and terrorist activities, communist-inspired in their nations. How many of us knew at that time that the South Africans were about to enter on the side of freedom, when Henry Kissinger convinced them not to intercede? When he did, the South African lead column was only 50 miles from Luanda, the capital of Angola, over which in the etheric plane is located the retreat of Arcturus and Victoria, one of the last retreats of freedom in the entire earth, for which the landed area was still free. Zadkiel's retreat over Cuba is over communist territory. The great divine directors were Kazi Mansion in Transylvania, Romania, Eastern Europe. Kuan Yin, communist China. So here you have Arcturus and Victoria over free earth. Here comes freedom fighters from South Africa, and Henry Kissinger convinces them not to intercede. Today, the role that Gulf Oil Company plays in Angola is of great importance. The government of Angola is dependent upon the tax revenues it receives from Gulf Oil to maintain even a semblance of solvency. When pro-Western guerrillas threatened to sabotage the plant in hopes of destabilizing the existing left-wing government and establishing a democratic government, the plant, Gulf Oil plant, was protected by Cuban troops who were assisted by the KGB, and the marriage of the multinational corporation and the international communist is complete. Now that was in the newspaper, and when you are armed with this understanding, you see right through it, and you can pick up much more of the strategies of the fallen ones from day to day by understanding what is really happening. Many people in the New Left are either skeptical or openly critical of the course that socialism has taken in the Soviet Union, likewise in China and even in Cuba. They long for a political system in which they can realize the goals of community, control over their own lives, and political equality. They reject capitalism out of hand because they believe that the free market will inevitably lead to monopolism, because of the indoctrination of Marx, because of the belief of the inevitability of human deception. But children of God and children of light can unite to uphold antitrust, anti-monopoly legislation. This is not so far from realization. Spread the word of this exposure. Get the sons and daughters of light elected to Congress, and you can reverse the course of this monopoly capitalism. Capitalism, just as the path of initiation, need not be invaded by the fallen ones. They can be controlled by laws and rules upheld by courageous men and women who see that the government shall be upon his shoulder, the shoulder of the Christ in each and every heart. The children of the light functioning in the left wing today have never seen a free market function, and all the propaganda is on the side of totalitarian control. Nevertheless, the things they desire are in many cases the kinds of political and economic freedom which can best be secured by a decentralized political and economic system complete with laissez-faire capitalism, such as found originally in the American Republic. Inasmuch as this is Independence Day and we commemorate our freedom from the tyranny personified in King George, let us pledge to be independent from all forms of government which monopolize our free will, our freedom to move, our freedom to draw forth the abundant life of God. In essence, let us claim our freedom from the manipulators in both capitalism and communism. Thank you.